Tonight is the wrap-up lecture by Murray Bookchin, in which, as we said last evening, the whole thesis, the whole hypothesis that urbanization without cities is based on and has been carefully developed over the last 3 evenings, the last 3 sets of lectures, now comes together. And the thesis is put in its most modern context, the contemporary period that we're living in through now. So hopefully we will go through this evening with a very high level of self-discipline, which will allow us to have ample time to not only have questions, but to have comments and to have some good discussion. I just want to emphasize again that what we have done with these lecture series is quite unusual. And it's certainly unusual for Montreal. That is to say, we have presented a series of insights, a body of analysis, over a period of several evenings, rather than having one lecture which is filled with oratorial flurry, a lot of entertainment, and one leaves without very much stimulation at the end. The idea of actually having a series which gradually develops a body of ideas is, I repeat, unfortunately, an unusual intellectual experience in Montreal. Hopefully this will not be the end of such an undertaking, but a beginning with other ideas of this sort. So I would now like to turn it over to Murray, who is going to take us, of course, through the carefully elaborated sort of chapter headings that we have followed, following his book, Urbanization Without Cities. We will take a break, and then we will come back again. Murray Bookchin.
Friends, this will be my last opportunity to discuss this, the last of 4 lectures. And I will not use any slides this time because I think I would like to open, and I ask you all to carefully consider the possibility of a very extensive give and take dialogue between all of us. And I will try to just clearly try to focus the point behind Urbanization Without Cities, the rise and fall of citizenship. Although the book is historical, it is historical because it is developmental. That's my way of thinking. I do not understand the thing I do not understand the person I know unless I know that person's biography. I don't go by tests, SATs, IQs, personality behavior tests. I want to know who the person is. I want to know where the person came from. I want to understand something about the potentialities of the person, whether these potentialities have been fulfilled, and how that person has developed either toward fulfillment, away from fulfillment, or whatever you like. Now, in saying that this is the way I view human beings, I'm saying this is the way I view reality. My view of reality is basically, what are the potentialities? What could have been, what should have logically followed where reason was involved. Now, I'm not using reason in a purely propositional, way. I'm using reason in a more developmental way, a biological way, growth, maturity, unfolding. And the book that I wrote, Urbanization Without Cities, was meant to unfold the potentialities of a new form of community, and with that a new form of politics. And it therefore has a very contemporary thrust. We have heard so much today about the political crises in which the world finds itself. Nationalisms, incompetence, warfare, at a time when we could have utopia, and I use utopia here without any hesitation, without any mystical meanings, without any belief that what I'm talking about is unrealizable, but in fact is eminently realizable. When we have the technological equipment, when we have the potential and even the ideals even if they haven't, we don't have the reality of what constitutes freedom. And where the material basis is such where we could not only improve the condition of humanity and emancipate it so that it will be free to function as free citizens in control of their own destiny, creating new types of communities which are truly organic without being locked into superstitious beliefs, we find ourselves in the ridiculous situation of tearing down the planet, literally undermining the biosphere. And believe me, I suspect we have perhaps no more than 50 or 60 years before we may go into irreversible effects with the ozone layer, the carbon, with the greenhouse effect, and a good many other things that are happening. But we find ourselves, in addition to that, assuming that the great advance of democracy that was supposed to take place with the breakup of the so-called Soviet Union, quote, close quotes, we now find that these countries are almost on the point of war with each other, and we find the prospects of a nuclear war in the Middle East a tremendous reality, a terrifying reality. Not between Russia and the United States, but between Israel, Arab countries, or Arab countries between each other, and God knows what's going to happen. So the situation has not gotten better, it has gotten worse, despite what Fukuyama has said about the end of history. Now, this book is eminently designed to move toward a new politics, a new political dispensation, and on top of that, a way of trying to develop a movement that corresponds to that new politics. My focus on the city has been to define the city because we have lost our sense of definition of the city. I've tried to show that urbanization, and I've used that word in a very specific sense, not of cityfication, but of sprawl, has not simply transcended the traditional antithesis between town and country, but has now begun to change the country. The country is becoming urbanized, and you don't have to have buildings there to make it urbanized, in the negative sense of urbanization. Just as cities have blended into each other and disappeared into each other into vast sweeping belts, which I call urbanization. But the countryside has now become urbanized. And in addition to that, with that urbanization has come formlessness. Formlessness in the sense that a homogeneity, a kind of, how shall I put it, and I don't mean this in the strict political sense, a kind of totalitarianism of behavior, of standards, of ways of living, and so on and so forth, of logistics, of production, of this and that, has turned what formerly was an ethical union called the city, or a religious union called the city, call it what you like, into something entirely different. It has turned what we call the city into a great urban belt, which largely corresponds to a corporate enterprise in which is involved not in servicing morale, in providing inspiration, in creating loyalties, in creating communities, in creating and enhancing empathy, but has turned the question of being a city literally into the question of being a corporation. And I've emphasized that we have created a world right now where goods and services correspond to the relationship of taxpayers to urban governments, and still more, to federal, regional governments, and finally to national governments and nation states, and so-called, currently, almost near imperiums called various communities, be it the European community, be it the American community, and who knows whatever community may emerge out of Japan, possibly in concert with China if they can overcome their differences. So what we used to call the city, which once had an ethical meaning, or once had a religious meaning, okay, has now turned into a corporate entity. And with that, citizens have become clients. They are no longer in control of the city. They work with pre-selected candidates. The only politics they have is a party politics, which I have argued is statecraft. So I've tried to develop that point, and I hope I have succeeded to some extent, while recognizing at the same time that the city played a great historic function, which must be restored again, and that is to say it broke down the kinship ties, real or fictitious, and created finally the basis for citizens, so that we could all, of different backgrounds, sit together in the same room and not go to war with each other because we belong to different tribes or different kinship groups. I've tried still further to define politics as well as citizenship. And I gave at least the Greeks as an example of what constituted citizenship, and that was in my previous discussion. But I've tried also not only to define what constitutes citizenship, I've also tried in the course of my discussions to point out that the function today of being a citizen has now turned us, actually, the traditional role of citizenship has turned us into consumers. We are essentially consumers of government, for which we pay taxes, of governmental services, for which we pay taxes. And our relationship basically is that no longer of citizens who have control of our lives, but who live in an entirely different sphere, and that's called statecraft. And in this particular connection, I made three basic divisions. I tried to distinguish the social, in which we live in our families, in which we do our work, in which we meet our friends, and so on and so forth, from the state, and that's a very traditional division, in which individuals are taken out of the community as professionals to manage our lives for us. We surrender our sovereignty and we surrender our authority and even our individuality to a great extent to so-called statesmen. And these statesmen can range from door catchers all the way up to chancellors, royalty, or whatever you like, presidents and premiers, and prime ministers. They are assigned the job of running life for us, ostensibly our representatives. But as Rousseau so well put it, we give up ourselves to them to run our lives for us. And the only moments, as Rousseau ironically observed in the social contract, when we are free is when we go into a polling booth and vote, and then while we're in the polling booth, we're free for 1 or 2 minutes, and once we step out, to use Rousseau's flamboyant language, we're all slaves. That you cannot divide the general will. You can't subdivide it and fractionate it and then afterward give it over to somebody else. Either you have that will or that will is dissolved. And that's what representatives do to them. So I argued for a redefinition, increasingly using historical examples, of what constituted a new sphere, which is neither the state nor the social. And that was the political sphere, or what has been called, rather parochially, loosely, conventionally, use whatever you like, the public sphere. This public sphere is disappearing today. It has not only been absorbed partly into the social, where we're told to retreat into ourselves, where we are told, in effect, that the personal is the political, or worse, that the political is the personal, until finally the political disappears completely. And we go through 12-step programs in order to find ourselves and to learn how to relate and to find the inner child in ourselves, which infantilizes us. And that has been occurring in the United States on a vast scale. The infantilization of the United States. The United States was juvenile while I lived in it, but now it's become infantile. But that infantilization that takes place involves the dissolution of the political, and the political was always understood as statecraft. That's where we get the word politician. Kennedy is a politician. Carter is a politician. Mulrooney is a politician. Okay? And all the various functionaries in government are politicians. But that isn't what the political sphere once meant. The political sphere, beginning particularly with Athens, democratic Athens, was distinguished from the state, where there were no professional politicians, and distinguished from the social, which you carried on within the sphere of your home or your friends and your companions and at your workplace. There was another sphere, a public sphere. There, the polis, and what was generally characterized as politics, politica, involved the direct participation of citizens in the management of the polis. And that polis had to be reasonably scaled to human dimensions, had to be comprehensible, and the citizens, and this was a new definition of a citizen, had to be not a serf or a client or a proletarian or an academic or whatever you like. A citizen had to be a rounded person who could understand public affairs, participate in them, and manage the polis. And I tried to indicate what kind of education the citizen went through, And in the case of Athens, around 450, all of Athens was one big school for citizenship. So that every week, every year, you were more of a citizen than you were the week before or the year before. You all will recall, those of you who were here, will recall that discussion. So we had a threefold distinction. The distinction between the social, the distinction between the political, and the distinction between the state. And we had another distinction, the distinction between the citizen, in the real Greek sense of the term, a politis, and I may be mispronouncing it, but P-O-L-I-T-E-S, a politis who was a citizen, who managed the polis in a direct face-to-face democracy, and was an amateur in the sense that he, and it was a patriarchal society, knew a great deal about everything, but was not an expert in any one single thing, except for athletics. That was a big thing with the Greeks. So, in this sense, the all-rounded citizen, educated repeatedly by living in the polis, which was itself the school of all of Greece, and was also the school of the individual citizen. And going to the assembly, going to the gymnasium, going to the wrestling schools, attending the philosophy academies and lyceum and so on and so forth. All of this formed a citizen who was forever, under the best of circumstances, growing under the Greek democracy. Finally, I tried, in order to sharpen this difference, to draw a distinction between the nation, state, and confederation. This was very important. Competing with each other over several thousand years, by the way, were two ways of organizing society. The one way of organizing society, and I beg you please not to work with conventional notions of confederation that you get from the Looney, or even from the Swiss, who come a little closer to what I mean by confederation. I'm talking of what the Greeks called the sympoliteia, or tia, sympoliteia. And that meant that all the towns, or cities, or poli more precisely, were each independent. All of them were direct democracies, but that they either formed councils, which were purely administrative, to manage all of the towns that confederated with each other, or in the most extreme cases, and most remarkable cases, like in the Achaean League, actually formed one huge town meeting of all the citizens of, say, 6 poli. They all came together, walking the distance to one of the Greek cities, one of the Greek poli, and polises, and there they met in one huge town meeting. And this happened on the several occasions in the sympoliteia that were formed by the ancient Greeks. I tried to show that confederation surfaced again very significantly in the Middle Ages, although by no means on the intense level of consciousness that existed among the Athenians particularly, and the Greeks pretty generally, who had a democratic consciousness. Now all of this was converging to several things. We have to do two things today. We have to recover citizenship, and we have to recover the city. The city today has been submerged increasingly by urbanization. You understand my definition of the term. And the citizen has been submerged by the taxpayer or the constituent. Look at it either way. And this has to be recovered if humanity is to recover control of its own destiny, if new kinds of communities are going to be formed, and if these communities are going to be truly democratic in a participatory way. So this has really been the basic intention of this whole lecture series. And the background has merely been the way toward developing to this basic intention, or these basic intentions, I should say, since they're more plural than anything else. And I gave some account, limited as it was, of various confederations that had been formed, partly in northern Italy during the Middle Ages, and to a more serious extent among the Germans, particularly the Rhenish confederations or leagues, and the Swabian confederations or leagues, if you want to, which played a major role at a certain point in deciding which way history would go. And I must include here, in particular, the year 1524 and 25, which was a turning point in the development of Europe. And that was when two major revolts took place. And both of them were directed against either centralized forms of government, in the case of Charles V in Spain, and the other one against the princely powers that were collecting under the Holy Roman Empire. The first of these revolts, around 1524, occurred in Castile, when the cities of Castile, which is the center of Spain, and included Madrid at that time was relatively inconsequential, Toledo, Valladolid, and so forth, in the Castilian cities rose up against Charles V and tried to establish a confederacy of cities. And that confederacy of cities was marked by its extreme democratic form. In the case of Valladolid, and also in the case of Toledo, even people who were not property owners, just ordinary citizens, people who are not even necessarily craftsmen, were given the right to vote, the franchise. And the assemblies were called, in some cases, in different wards. In different wards. Because at that time, one single assembly would have been too large to manage and to make decisions. And additionally, an armed militia was created, and battles were won against Charles V, until finally the barons, essentially, or what in France and Spain, essentially were the various counts and whatever you like, ganged up together with the monarchy to subdue this uprising, which they were equivocal about. And then in 1525 there was the Great Peasant War in Germany, which greatly decided the history of Central Europe, in which the towns, not only the peasants, and this is the most recent information that has now come out about the peasant wars. Many people don't know to what extent history has to be rewritten as a result of research over the past 10 and 20 years. The towns joined with the peasants, Cologne and others, to rise up against the Holy Roman Empire and against the princes, and were defeated, almost coming close to victory. That was to change the history of Europe and profoundly affect the history even of North America. Because from that point onward, nation-states began to develop. And it's very important for us to get a better understanding of two things: what a confederation is and what a state is, in order to fix our ideas more clearly on what would constitute a new politics. And I would like to spend tonight doing the following things. One, to define the development of states, define the development of confederations as briefly as possible, because we have very mistaken notions about the state. We don't realize that the state comes to us in degrees. It does not come to us in one fell swoop. It's not constituted, certainly, although states have been constituted after great revolutions, such as the American Revolution and such as the French Revolution, where literally constitutions were drawn up to create a state. But we also have to understand what the nation state in particular is and how it differs from other states, because that's what we live under today. And we have to have a better understanding of what constitutes a confederation if we are going to try to create a confederation of municipalities that alone, in my opinion, and I will argue this case emphatically, constitutes a new politics. Because we keep on hearing about the need for a new politics, and then we find the same garbage coming up on the slates, the same electoral processes taking place in the same ways, with the same programs, slightly modified, slightly burnished, slightly altered here, and slightly rearranged there. And you have only to look at the American primary elections to see that what everybody is talking about in the form of a new politics is worse than the garbage I saw in the 1930s. In fact, more closely resembles the garbage I recall even as a child in the 1920s when Alfred A. Smith was running against Herbert Hoover, 28. So there has been no new politics, just been a lot of rhetoric on this score. What will constitute organically a new politics? And in this respect, I want to briefly survey several points and then enter into the question of a new politics and open the floor for discussion. And I know one of the key questions that will be asked is, how do you manage a city of 3 million people on the basis of confederation and either councils or neighborhood assemblies? So I anticipate that, and I will give examples of that as well. Let me go in first of all to what the state is, and it's rather important to deal with. The first thing that I would like to deal with so far as the state is concerned is that there are various kinds of states and various degrees of statification. And statification is an original word. You won't find it in the dictionary. I had trouble when I used it the first time round in post-scarcity anarchism. I was trying to indicate how you engage in literally statification. And they kept on putting down stratification, which is exactly the opposite of much of what I have to say. I was favoring the abolition of statification, and suddenly it came out that I was in favor of stratification. The printer taking it upon his or her own initiative to put an R in there, since the Webster Dictionary doesn't contain the word. So we are using new words. But then again, so did Aristotle and Hegel. All right? They made up their own words. Let's go into this, very simply. The earliest form of state comes to us, basically, as a patrimony. If anyone has read the Epic of Gilgamesh, the closing of the epic, which is one of the most evocative statements in the history of political thought, is when Gilgamesh, finding out that he can no longer become immortal, and Gilgamesh was one of the chieftains, if you want to call that, or kings of Erech or Uruk, depending upon whether you want to use Sumerian or you want to use the Hebrew Bible. And he's unruly, and finally seeking, since he's half, 3/4 God, and 1/4 is at 50-50, I'm not sure, God and 1/4 mortal, wants to become completely deified and become literally part of the great cycles of nature. And I don't want to go into the question of eternal recurrence here, all right? And in the pursuit of that, he finally finds that he can never become immortal. He must remain mortal. And then at the end is a very powerful Sumerian statement. It says, Gilgamesh, reconcile yourself to the fact that you must die. But remember well, and this is a very powerful thought for that era, we're talking about almost 6,000 years ago. Remember well that you will live forever in the memory of your descendants and of the people who have ruled and their descendants. For dispense justice to the palace. Do well to the servants of the palace. And I don't want to go into the rest of the conclusion. Now that idea of the palace and its servants forms the initial formation of the ancient state. The states that existed in ancient Egypt, or in the so-called city-states and empires of Mesopotamia and of Persia, was seen as patrimonies. That is to say, everybody was a servant of the palace. Whether that individual worked the land, whether that individual was a slave, whether that individual was a free-born noble or just an ordinary citizen, was a servant of the monarchy, who was the surrogate for the deity in whose hands the land belonged. So everyone was seen, and this is the emergence of the primitive state, out of the chieftains into the monarchies in which the state initially is a patrimony. And as a patrimony, everyone is a servant of the monarchy. A second feature, aside from the temple states that emerged, were the development of another form of state, which was to succeed this patrimony, or in fact become part of this patrimonial state. And this was the second type, a bureaucratic state. And these bureaucratic states were never to entirely disappear from history. They appeared very markedly in ancient Egypt, and they appeared over Stalin. The same bureaucracy, that is bureaucratic infrastructure, which managed and mediated and dealt with everything, and administered everything. That was to be one of the most long-lasting states, in which the state acquired a life of its own. And the reason why I'm stressing this is that people who believe in a minimal state, and there are endless numbers of people who argue that, do not realize that a state has a logic. Having once created a state, the state now tends to metastasize, to proliferate, to multiply, to acquire a cancerous quality in which one bureau becomes two, in which the two bureaus are then squared to become four, in which the four bureaus are squared to become 16, and that's only taking one bureau. So the minimal state is one of the greatest myths that exist today. The idea of the minimal state. And if history shows us anything, and one of the most striking examples of this bureaucratic state, leaving the Stalinist state aside, was the Ptolemaic state in ancient Egypt, succeeding Alexander's control of the Mediterranean basin, Ptolemy being the general who took over Egypt and portions of North Africa, but especially Egypt. Cleopatra was a Ptolemy. Now, that state literally became an end in itself. It became the alpha and omega of all life, and everything was in the service of the state, and everything, in a sense, was bureaucratic, so that everyone became a functionary in the state. The tendency of the state to take on this form is occurring more and more today than at any time, apart from the Stalinist development, in modern history. The enormous growth of bureaucracy as a substitute for any kind of community. The organic ties that used to hold even earlier states together, not to speak of the organic ties that held the polis together, are now being replaced by professionals. And in my book, a bureaucrat is not simply somebody who gives you a license, who marries you, who buries you, and so forth, who collects your taxes and polices you, and etc. In my opinion, a bureaucrat is also a psychotherapist. In my opinion, a bureaucrat is a counselor who tells you whether or not you should or you should not find your inner child, or whether or not you should or you should not seek a man or a wife, or a husband or a wife, or whether or not you should or you should not have children. This bureaucratization of experience, where you don't consult your own mind, your own conscience, and your own friends, but deliver for 15 minutes to a half hour, depending upon what the charge may be, or even an astrologer, as Nancy Reagan did. Go to a specialist in a specific field that you should have competence over, is, in my view, an evidence of bureaucratization. And this subtle bureaucratization of life is taking place on a scale that makes us unaware of the extent to which the bureaucratic tendrils of various professional societies and the state move into the most intimate aspects of our lives, of our bedrooms, of our kitchens, on how to raise children, on how to keep them free from drugs, or how to get them to take the right medicine, or what to eat, how to eat the right cereal. In fact, the whole advertising industry is, in its own way, a counseling agency for profit. To get you, or to get your children, to nag you into buying something that you don't need. But the point that I'm trying to get at is people no longer take counsel with themselves. And that bureaucratic state is thousands of years old. The only thing is that it was more explicit 5,000 or 3,000 or 2,000 years ago. More explicit then than it is now. Now it permeates your life in more subtle ways. Additionally, we have feudal states, which we're only too aware of. Little baronials, and the mafia is a kind of feudal state in its own way, that now permeates, by the way, all of Italian life. Southern Italy today is almost, politics today is almost impossible in southern Italy, and I was told in Sicily was absolutely impossible because of the mafia. And that is a tremendous bureaucracy. Godfather, too, shows you the transformation from the patrimonial godfather who still speaks Italian and starts off dancing with his daughter and has deep loyalties besides having business ties, to the bureaucratic young Al Pacino, who is now exclusively nothing more than a technocratic monster in a sense, without even knowing it. He is now the pure corporate businessman, and yet he's a member of the mafia. So this kind of feudal state we're aware of, where you have capos and so on and so forth who do your business for you, and often replace you. And of course we have the royal state, uniquely European, which began to appear. Now these are different degrees of statification. Under the feudal state there was a great deal of autonomy. There was a lot you could do behind the back of the capo or the baron. You had a lot of free rein. Under the bureaucratic state, on the other hand, which is now becoming more and more the totalitarian state, whether it has a friendly face or whether it's run by the KGB in the interest of the Stalin, you have a fundamental change. And today we are beginning to witness the emergence of the bureaucratic state with a vengeance. If you accept my notion that the bureaucracy consists not only of the government officials who ordinance you all the way through your life from birth to death, and even follow you beyond the grave, but additionally organize your whole life for you in the form of various counselors, in the form of various therapists, in the form of various experts who are prepared to take care of everything from your fingernails to whether or not you should commit suicide, and what to read in order to do it. Or will do it for you, as we know with one particular physician. Now this is not an idle joke. It reflects the extent to which we have become de-citizenized. It reflects the extent to which we are uncertain of our own competence. It reflects the breakdown of community and those communal and support systems that made it possible for us to become truly rounded individuals. And truly, and here we can contrast the Roman cult of libertas with the Greek idea of eleutheria. The Greek idea of freedom, eleutheria, consisted of the idea that you were part of a mutual support group. You belonged to a phratry, which was P-H-A-R-A-T-R-Y, which was a kind of fraternity. You belonged to a distinct cohort in the military made up of your own friends. You belonged to an extended family. You had a tremendous network of friends around you. You had an enormous flow of intercourse, a rich civility that the Greeks identified with civilization itself, that made it possible to have discourse without having needless recourse to violence. That corporate world, in fact, made for very strong individuals. And again, I must refer you back to the eloquence of the funeral oration that Pericles delivers during the course of the Peloponnesian War, to get a picture of what that world was like. Today, and notice the contrast, we are not only taxpayers and constituents instead of being citizens. We are taxpayers preeminently. We are literally hounded on that question. We are constituents bombarded by politicians who in no sense of the word are politicians but statecraft operators. And in that way, together with the councils and the educational system and the whole vast bureaucracy, we are more isolated than ever. We have never been more isolated, and therefore, in a sense, counseling and bureaucracy becomes a self-fulfilling phenomenon. It creates the need, insofar as you are stripped of any organicity, stripped of any civic protoplasm. You have to use these services. You have to go to the various 12-step programs. There's a 12-step program for everything. I'm trying to talk so quickly, I'm falling over my words. Forgive me. There's a 12-step program for everything. And that is the ultimate in de-citification, in de-citizenization, and the loss of the organic aspects that constitute true civic life. And with that, you finally have the permeation, whether directly or indirectly, whether psychologically or structurally, of the state into your very personality, not to speak of what remains in the most shriveled form of a public sphere. And this, for example, is a public sphere. I want to contrast that with confederation. And that brings me very close to what I would like to virtually close on. With confederation, we are talking of something fundamentally different that has always competed with the state. As I told you, the year 1525 can almost be regarded as a turning point in the direction either toward or against confederation or toward or against the nation state. Although this struggle for confederation was to continue right into the 20th century, particularly in certain Mediterranean countries, and even was to repeat itself very recently, at least within the past 10 years, in England, when the Thatcher government tried to smash the last control that the cities had over their own destiny, such as break up the Greater London Council and so on and so forth, and where finally one began to hear of such things as municipal socialism and local socialism. The confederal approach has been one which, with varying degrees of consciousness or unconsciousness, has always competed with the nation state, and that has been part of the narrative that I've been involved in up to now. I've tried to give you illustrations of confederal struggles, but what is a confederation? What is a confederation? If one does not confuse confederation with federalism, and federalism is essentially what exists in the United States, a republican system, and you have federalism in Canada, don't think that you have a Canadian confederation. It's a degradation of the word confederation to call what is really a federal system confederation. The federal system is representative. It is republican, and with a small r. Here you give the power over to a representative, and that representative is a professional statesperson. And you can go up to varying degrees, be it to a prime minister, to a president, or a chancellor. It makes no difference. And by the way, note well that the word chancellor was really the king's private secretary originally. And now has become literally a position in Germany, for example, chancellor. And for a period of time, incidentally under the monarchy, in England, the chancellors were essentially the ones who ran things for kings like Henry II and so forth. Now the point is, in a republican system, you deliver the power over to a statesperson, and that can be federal. It's federal insofar as it is not under the control of an arbitrary ruler like a monarch. There you have a constitution. It is constituted. Rights and duties are spelled out. Certain liberties are granted, in return for which certain services have to be delivered to the state, be it in the form of conscription or whatever you like. Now, in that federal system, power runs from the top down. The supreme power is, of course, the nation state itself. In the United States, it's Washington. All states are subordinated to that nation state. The Constitution of the United States operates on the principle that whatever power, residual power remains, that the national government does not claim for itself, can go to the state. And that can always be overruled anyway. It can even be overruled. You can pass legislation or amend the Constitution so that you can even deprive the states, which consist in the United States of 50 miniature republics themselves, of any power, or whatever powers they claim for themselves. So whatever the federal government, or more precisely the national government, does not claim for itself, the states have. And then after, the cities are nothing but creatures, and this is the legal term, as I pointed out in the previous discussion, of the state. The state legislature has to give to New York, even though it has home rule, any right to tax that it asks for. It cannot on its own innovate a tax. If it has a sales tax, it must bring that proposal, or it wants a sales tax, it must bring that proposal to the state legislature, which then, like the Congress of the United States legislating for the states, that state legislature legislates for the city council. So the autonomy of the city council, although it can have a wide degree of latitude so far as education is concerned, police are concerned, and other such incidentals, is minimal. And it still is regarded as having home rule. There are some cities and towns, not some, but many, that have no rights. And there are finally some cities that acknowledge the fact that they are nothing but corporations, no longer civic entities, and what they have is literally a city manager. The manager being the board of directors or the exchequer or the equivalent thereof, and no longer even has the honorific title of being called the mayor, or having a board of aldermen or eldermen, or having even a city council. He manages the city in the same way that a bookkeeper or an accountant manages a business for the owner of the business. And this esoteric knowledge is kept within the framework and within the life and within the office of the city manager. When that begins to develop, the city is explicitly a corporation, a business enterprise, nothing else. It has no civic qualities whatever. It has no connotation of anything political whatever. It is a statist business enterprise that is really under the sovereignty of still higher state forms. So the power goes down from top to bottom. And public control at the base of the society consists of, and here we come again, I want to go back to the Roman cult of libertas among the Romans, where the Greeks had eleuteria to mean power through association and organic ties. Individual freedom as a function of belonging to a community with the community support that makes individuality possible. The Roman cult of libertas, which is what we have today, including Canada, is the idea that you do not meddle in the public business, but you're free to do anything you want. You can sleep with whoever you want to, you can eat whatever you want, you can commit suicide. Obviously it's against the law, but still, who's going to, if you finally succeed, who's finally going to penalize you for that? They just bury you, that's all. The Roman cult of libertas was calculated to give you negative freedom. The freedom not to interfere with anyone else's freedom. That's it. Otherwise, you could do whatever you want if it didn't interfere with anyone else's freedom. And that was a specious form of freedom. So where eleutheria meant that you had positive freedom, where you had obligation, and where people had an obligation to you, and you were not an isolated person, but you were conceived of for all your individuality as part of a group. Libertas, in the Roman sense, meant that you were a sole atom. Now, in practice, this was not the case until the breakup of the empire. With the breakup of the empire, it was very much the case. And this was reflected in the atomism of Lucretius, the atom free-floating. It was reflected philosophically there. It was reflected in the idea that you could be a libertine in Rome, and the more you had, the better you had, the more enjoyable it was. Stay out of the public business. The public business was really the business of the state. The state was no public. It was a series of conspiracies among the Roman emperors who mutually poisoned each other, or were poisoned by their wives, or by their sons, or by whatever, as we know from that whole Claudian line that ended with Claudius. Now, the question of a new politics that now emerges is how can we begin, and what must be our point of departure for seriously taking politics seriously? And here I don't care to even look at my notes. The first thing we have to do is to try to create citizenship. And one of the most important mediums that we have is what the Greeks call paideia, education. But not education, but education in the form of character building at the same time that you have education. In other words, we have to begin to create little social units that can provide those support systems, can provide those interrelationships, can in short provide that degree of character building which ultimately must be given over to the community as a whole. It can't be done by a movement and it can't be done by an individual, but it has to be a goal. It has to be a kind of ideal end toward which one strives in trying to create groups mutually trustful of each other, capable of beginning to engage in the process of paideia and forming at least the rudiments of citizenship. And the rudiments of citizenship must begin with a thorough education in politics. And when I say a thorough education in politics, I mean an education in what it means in history and what it means in our own time to manage our own lives, and above all, to enter into and begin to create a public sphere. And this, I'm not suggesting that the personal has to be, the political has to be dissolved into the personal. What I'm trying to say is we have to begin to educate ourselves to function and create, or help create, or catalyze, use whatever language you like, a public sphere. And the immediate public sphere in the city is the neighborhood. The quartier, call it whatever you want. But to the extent that it is possible that people can develop a community interest, not simply around the work that they do, that was what the syndicalists tried to do. Those who believed in one or another form of socialist or anarchist trade unionism. Not that. Because today, people want to leave that sphere. If I know workers well, as I did years ago, I know that workers keep watching the clock. They don't want to manage an industry, except insofar as they can utilize that management to preserve their jobs. What they want to do is go, in one way or another, back to their own lives, or to recover a life for themselves, and a life with their families, and a life with their friends. So the neighborhood has certain commonalities which even a worker shares. The worker is not only interested in labor and in the fight with capital, a fight which has already dwindled down to the near vanishing point. The worker is also either a husband or a wife, or a man or a woman, or a neighbor, or a person who is concerned with the destiny of his or her children, has relatives, has friends, and is concerned with the fact that he doesn't know, or she doesn't know, whether his or her children or others finds have a future in this world. And one of the biggest problems we face right now is that a generation is emerging that is a no future generation. It is faced with the fact that it doesn't know what's going to happen to the planet, not to speak of what's going to happen in interstate relationships or international relationships, in trying to survive. The argument that we hear in the United States today is that the generation of the 50s had the last of the good life. And that from here on in it's going to get grimmer and grimmer as the years go by. And with very good reason. Especially when it takes ecological considerations, you know what I mean, into consideration. Ecological factors into consideration. So the first step is toward creating a movement whose goal is to raise consciousness among those people who are prepared to participate in such a movement. And that means that that movement is engaged in paideia. It's engaged in the process of trying to enlarge the public sphere. And the immediate public sphere, which is right outside your threshold, aside from your own family, which is not quite the public sphere, is exactly your neighborhood. That is what you step right into in the morning, and that's what you cross into your home when you go at home in the evening. And it is not simply the workplace. It is overwhelmingly the house that you live in and the housing that you have, the amenities that you have, and not only, well, very importantly, the rights you can claim to have some control over this world which you live in, and to establish those connections within the community so that inside this urban block you have the reemergence again of communities. A movement dedicated to that purpose must be a municipalist. And it must be confederal in the sense that where the federal republican system operates with the idea of power going downward from the top, this movement tries to create a politics where power really begins and remains at the bottom and diminishes as it goes up to the top, assuming we know what we mean by top and bottom. And in the case of the bottom here, where the decisions are made, a sphere has to be created. So such a movement must be a neighborhood movement. It must be a movement located in the neighborhood, and it must begin to define that neighborhood as part of a town, village, or city. Or more precisely, a village or city. I mean a town or city. Insofar as neighborhoods do exist, their nature has to be cultivated, their uniqueness has to be cultivated, their cultural identity has to be cultivated. And insofar as these neighborhoods form a composite with a municipality, that municipality has to acquire its own identity. And it must increasingly be made up of, through the creation of a public sphere of citizens, not constituents or taxpayers. Is my thought coming through on this? The principle. The details we can go into later. Okay? After that, the question is, in creating a public sphere, can you separate the creation of a public sphere so necessary for the creation of a citizen from politics itself? Namely, our definition of politics, which is the management of the polis, or the management of the community. And now we come to the problem of the extent to which the neighborhood can be integrated with other neighborhoods to create a new kind of politics based on the municipality. Not only on, but the municipality consisting of an organic connection between the neighborhoods. At that particular point, citizenship reinforces politics, and politics reinforces citizenship. It's a reciprocal process. To the extent that one engages in politics, one becomes more of a citizen. To the extent that one becomes more of a citizen, it's because one is also engaging more and more in politics, in creating a public sphere, a political sphere. And this political sphere, if it's going to be democratic in the real sense of the term, of the demos, or the people controlling their destiny, must be a municipal sphere. The municipality has to carve out its identity, no matter what its size may be, made up of its neighborhoods, and must begin to struggle to create a public sphere, a field of politics. And from the neighborhoods must come the real power. Not the loss of power, but empowered neighborhoods, creating that system or form of organization and now let's call it confederal, not federal, where all neighborhoods are interlinked by councils through one council, always subject to recall, always subject to public scrutiny, in which policy making is made at the bottom and administration is left to what is called the top, namely the city council. Now let's make a distinction between administration on the one side and policy making on the other. And this created a great deal of confusion in the Marxist movement. The two have to be separated from each other. Marx called for their integration in the Paris Commune and celebrated the fact that the Paris Commune engaged in that integration. That is a grave error. Not everyone can execute policy. It may require specialists, obviously. It may require people with unusual skills or very well-trained skills to do that. But everyone can, given that competence, given that education, given that idea, at least understand what the issues are and make rational decisions of these issues. So the policy must be made at the base through the neighborhoods, whatever form they take, be they assembly forms or be they council forms. And any council form would have to be supervised by the people at large, open to everyone. And the councils subject to recall on the neighborhood basis. Their policy would be formulated. The policy would then be coordinated by a confederal council that is citywide in character. You follow me? From the neighborhoods to the citywide level. There, it would be a problem of coordinating in those citywide councils different policies, trying to adjust them, bring them into some kind of synchronicity to each other, and also creating the means for executing them. And the execution of these policies is a purely administrative task. Purely administrative, carefully supervised. It is not the formulation of a policy, it's the execution of a policy. And only to the extent that it is necessary. So that the city council's function is to coordinate different policies decided by neighborhood groups, whatever groups these may be. And then afterward, returning them to the neighborhood groups and let the neighborhood groups finally approve them on the basis of majority vote. Then afterward, and this is a very striking example of a confederation, afterward, not only can the city, no matter what its size be, become a confederation, a civic confederation, but then you can have inter-city confederations. In the United States, we have counties. On the county-wide level, different cities often exist that can form county-wide confederal councils. These confederal councils will then try to adjudicate the interacting processes and the interacting politics involved between the different cities. And their job, again, is one of adjudication, not one of policy-making, and also of administration. And that, in turn, would be returned to the confederal councils of the various cities. And these, in turn, could be explored and examined by the communities themselves on the neighborhood level or on the town-wide level, depending upon the number of people that can be assembled. After which, policy can be formulated on a county-wide basis, and then, if you like, on a provincial-wide basis, and so on. This is the principle of confederation, as distinguished from the nation-state. So policy is made on the bottom, whereas in the nation-state it's made on the top. It's made by your House of Commons and by your Senate, or by your Prime Minister and the Executive. Here, policy in the Confederation, that's the state form. On the Confederation, policy is made by the community, but coordinated through confederal councils and executed through confederal councils, and always returned and subject to revision by the community, by majority vote. And that can be extended indefinitely throughout the whole continent. That can be extended indefinitely from within confederations in large cities to confederations between cities, through confederations between towns, each united by confederal councils with less and less power, always having to return to what you might call the lesser but really more important councils until finally you get to the grassroots themselves. Now, has this system ever worked, or is this a pure dream? One of the most striking examples of how this system worked was in the French Revolution in 1700. And you said, oh, but that's 200 years ago. Then they could do anything. Well, I'll tell you what they could do. Nothing could move faster than a horse. Whereas now, all you have to do is pick up a telephone and you can call England in 15, 20 seconds. So nothing could move faster than a horse. That's number one. The city of Paris. The city of Paris had between 700,000 to 1 million people. It was the second largest city next to London, if my memory is correct. I don't know if there was a third city that was larger, undoubtedly in Asia, yes. But certainly in Europe, it was the second largest city. Its logistical system was horrendous. Today, you would regard it as a nightmare. Okay? People walked more often than rode. Okay? So you couldn't move much faster than 30 miles an hour, if that fast. And that really required speed. The sanitary system was a mess, and the logistical system, the means of communication, was a mess. And yet in 1793, 48 sections were established to manage the city of Paris. These sections, each one had a battalion of the National Guard and artillery, and they essentially consisted of neighborhood meetings, meeting in churches primarily. As you know, the revolutionaries were not very enthusiastic about the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church's institutions were turned into civic centers. In these sections, the people gathered roughly about once a week. Sometimes they went into emergency sessions and would meet every night. Ultimately, they were paid for the amount of time that they lost. I don't want to go into the details and ins and outs of the French Revolution. I want to show you how it worked. Nobody was paid. The president of the section was not paid. The recording secretary was not paid. The people who kept watch over the sections were not paid. The various committees that formed up the sections, and there were at least about a half a dozen of them, were not paid. They all ran it in the name of a given section. 48 divisions of Paris, which were more or less organic. That is to say, some were definitely working class, some were middle class, some were, in fact, even counter-revolutionary in many cases. That is, the majority of the section was. And that city united its activities partly through the Paris Commune, which was the city council, where each section sent, I think if my memory is correct, 2 members, but I could be wrong, maybe more, maybe a little, maybe 1, or maybe more than 1, or more than 2. Each one sent a member to the Paris Commune, which was the city council. The Commune met in the city hall, and there coordinated the decisions of the sections. And many of the sections, some being very revolutionary, coordinated with each other, quite aside from the city hall. And others worked through the city hall. So you had a dual power existing side by side with the national government, initially called the National Assembly and later called the Convention, as presided over by people like Robespierre, Danton, Marat, and the whole crowd. They were centralists. Ultimately, to establish the Committee of Public Safety, taken from the American Revolution, to become extreme centralists. And they eventually demolished the sections. And how they did that is a whole separate story by itself. But for a period, during the most heated period of the French Revolution, when the Duke of Brunswick was coming in with a coalition of armies, particularly Austrian troops, when Valmy was the great moment of, truth for the French Revolution, when the revolutionaries, the country was being invaded. At that particular point, it was Paris that spearheaded the revolution, and it was the sections that spearheaded Paris. So try to form this reality in your mind under the most adverse conditions of communication. In a population of ranging between 700,000 to 1 million, 48 sections met, going into emergency sessions at times packed with 1,000 people, depending upon the issue, and sometimes dwindling down to 30. Again, depending upon the issue. People met in these sections and literally made the French Revolution. If there are any architects of the French Revolution, it is not Robespierre, it is not Danton, it is not Marat, it is not that whole crowd, most notably the Jacobins. It was the sections that made the French Revolution. They were the ones who did the following. They got food for Paris, sending out committees to try to work out interchanges with the peasantry, which was fairly close to the city. They were the ones who equipped the National Guard which at that time was the principal army, armed force, through their own resources. They were the ones who saw that the prices were kept, that nobody was cheating, that the royalists were watched and also arrested, going into houses and finding out where the royalists were. They were the ones who administered whatever law existed in Paris, while the convention sat around with different factions, each one trying to beat the other one. The Girondins fighting the Jacobins, and then the Jacobins fighting between themselves, and then finally Robespierre trying to smash the sections. Ultimately, a point was reached where the secretary of the Paris Commune sent out a letter to the 30,000 communes, which means the equivalent of city councils of France at that point, calling for a commune of communes in counterposition to the national government. This was a completely confederal mentality. There would be a grand assembly, a fête de fédération. Allow me for the fact that I'm an American and very poor in pronouncing French, or French terms. A festival of the federations gathered together, and they would form a new system of confederation of confederations against Robespierre, the National Assembly and Convention. I'm using the word National Assembly because the word convention, as a conventional term, usually denotes just a gang of people getting together and carrying on, be it a convention of physicians, salesmen, or whatever you like. The word convention comes from the American Revolution. And let me tell you, in the United States, in New England, for a period of time, you had essentially a confederal system. Boston, for example, had a town meeting in which once you were a resident of Boston, and a registered voter as it were, anyone, irrespective of property or whatever you like, could enter into the town meeting and participate in it. And when the town became too large and became a city, the city of Boston, they divided the town meetings into separate wards. If there were, say, about a dozen wards, they had a dozen town meetings for each ward. And the city council at most coordinated the decisions of the town meetings for Boston. So the thing that I am describing right now is not a myth. It's a reality. And it's a searing reality. It occurred. And you can study it. And there's a literature on it. This is the alternative to nation-state politics, which is today paralyzing the world. This is the alternative. Confederation versus nation-state. Assemblies of one sort or another, or councils, versus the domination of the bureaucracy, participation of citizens in full activity in every aspect of their lives, and the knitting together and hopefully the paideia that will make for true citizens, as well as create a true public. This is what I would call confederal or libertarian municipalism. And this is the thrust of the entire book, toward that kind of politics. And admittedly, this is a dual power. If such a confederation were established, and let me tell you how hysterical the nation-state gets when it hears that the cities are acquiring any amount of autonomy, they go into paroxysms of fear. The attempt, for example, in Vermont, my own state, to try to create this kind of system in counterposition to the state government literally led to screams of anarchy. Because there's nothing a statesman is more convinced of. That is that if a citizen emerges who's engaged in politics, he or she is the greatest threat that the state government faces. And I'm only talking of the state government, although the equivalent to your provincial governments. On the federal level, forget it. Reagan's new federalism was giving money to the separate 50 republics that make up the United States, not giving them to the communities. And the struggle of communities to try to gain power for themselves has been more ferocious than any of the fights you hear of in American electoral politics, and I'm sure that you would encounter in Canadian politics or Quebec politics. And that is an issue today that cannot be subdued. It was a furious issue, but unfortunately it was not done self-consciously in England between the Thatcher government and the various councils that existed, council governments that existed in the British cities. During that period of time when Thatcher was trying to take away the power from the cities, or at least the Greater London Council and so on and so forth. a real fuel. You must recognize that the psychology of such a statesmanship is as follows. That you are incompetent to run political life. As I pointed out earlier, you're competent to drive a car at 90 miles or 80 miles, kilometers an hour, 100 kilometers an hour. That's okay. And they want you to buy cars that go that fast. That's okay. You're competent enough to serve in the military. You're competent enough to fly airplanes and bombard Iraqi troops or bombard any other troops that may suit your purpose. That's okay. You're competent to keep the wheels of industry going. You're competent to form corporations. You're competent to engage in S&L scandals and swindles. That's okay. You're competent to give out mortgages that aren't worth the paper that they are made of. You're competent to counterfeit money. You're competent to do anything. But you're not competent to run the state. You are incompetent. And this notion that you are incompetent is the principal psychological basis of statism. That you are incompetent. And they make you incompetent. They work at making you incompetent. They provide you with all the bureaucrats that are necessary to make you incompetent. The essence of confederalism, of municipal politics, of the recreation of politics in the sense that I've defined it based on the Hellenic meaning of the term, is that you are potentially, minimally speaking, competent. If you can drive a tank, if you can read the board, the flashing, that light show on an F-15 airplane, if you are competent to fire weapons in every which way in whatever direction, if you are competent to work in steel mills and deal with extremely massive machinery, if you are competent to work a word processor, then you are competent to manage the society better than Nancy Reagan, and particularly that idiot that she was married. You are competent than any Hollywood actor. And the United States today is parading nothing but Hollywood actors these days up for, and by the way, the media is dealing with them as Hollywood actors. Bill Clinton, there's, what do you call that thing when you airbrushed hair? What is it?
Blow-dried.
Blow-dried hair. I'm sorry, I don't do this. First of all, I don't have the hair, I don't have the equipment. With this blow-dried hair, there's really a personality. And Jerry Brown, if you can dig deep enough into the toilet, you'll find another personality, if you want to call it a personality. And George Bush, in the middle of the most serious, at the very point when the United States was engaged in Desert Storm, don't pick anything short of storm, he was playing golf. When these people disappeared, this was like Franco, it took them a year to announce that he was dead. The government still went on. The bureaucracy still came to work. In fact, after the Russian Revolution, to the amazement of Lenin and Trotsky, the very next day that they took the Winter Palace, everybody went to work as regular. They didn't even know that the revolution had occurred. And yet the government had been removed. The government had been removed. The bureaucracy was generating itself. Its own paper, its own stamps, counting its own money, and so forth. And Lenin went around to Trotsky and said, this is amazing. I never thought it would be that easy. And the whole government was dispersed. So they are competent, you understand, but you're not. What must be organized today is a movement. It will not be done on an individual basis. It must be done consciously, the way the Greeks tried to preserve their democracy through consciousness, as well as educational and character building. It must be done with a deep and serious intentionality, because what is at stake literally is going to be your own spirit. Capitalism is not only simplifying the planet, wiping out different species, pushing back the geologic clock, turning even the very atmosphere into something that may have been more primeval than the one we have over recent memory, and still hopefully have, before an ionosphere was even formed. It is pushing not only back the ecological clock, but it is pushing back literally and homogenizing and desiccating and making less differentiated the human spirit. Until now we accept things that were never accepted 50 years ago, that were put into question. Workers, at least 50 years ago, were class conscious. Now they call us middle-class workers. And everybody talks to the middle class, not to the workers anymore. Because the workers themselves are losing their class consciousness. The capitalist system is regarded as the end of history, a la Fukuyama. In his book, The End of History, and The Last Individual, Fukuyama argues that liberal democratic capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, is the end of history. There's no further you can go. You've exhausted all the potentialities of social development. And this notion is not so much an intellectual notion. People are being born today who say, well, if you abolish capitalism, where am I going to get a job? Where am I going to get a job? The idea that we can have a society from each according to his or her abilities and to each according to his or her needs is regarded as, well, I never heard that before. How are you going to abolish money? You've got to have money. The idea that we would have a distributive economy, that people and machinery would be used to meet human needs and to meet the natural needs, the need to maintain the integrity of the natural world. That idea is alien. Even among Green parties today, it's alien. You can talk to Greens in Germany, you can talk to Greens in England, you can talk to Greens in other parts of the world. And if you ask them, basically, do they want to change the system? What do you mean change the system? How do you change the system? I mean the capitalist system. What do you mean the capitalist system? A tiger is a capitalist. A worker is a capitalist. Anybody who owns a house is a capitalist. When you start getting this idea that this society is the natural outcome of everything, in fact, there never even was a history. It's merely that capitalism has undergone various reforms, transformations, and permutations. If this has become the natural society for you, then the struggle is yours. Then you're going to use your brain not to create, but you're going to use your brain to adapt. You see, the brain can be used in three ways. It can be used to create, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Beethoven, Bach. Choose what you want. That's the creative. Okay? Think of great writers and women like George Sand and the like. Of the Brontes and so forth. Louise Michel, Emma Goldman. That's a creative book. The brain can be used to destroy. Hitler, Stalin. But the brain can also be used just to adapt, to take what is and make the best of it. Whether you're in Auschwitz, you make the best of it, or whether you're living in a ghetto, you make the best of it, or whether you're living on Park Avenue, what's left of it, and you make the best of it. You make the best of everything. And we must recover again the creative dimension of our brains, not the adaptive dimension and not the destructive. Because we already have an overwhelmingly adaptive mentality, and very frequently, more often passes into destruction. This requires the development of a movement. It requires a collaborative effort, and above all, it requires the consciousness to engage in the need for a new politics, and a new citizenship, and a new movement. And a new power to countervail the power of the corporations and to countervail the power of the ever-increasing and ever-centralized state. And that is the main point behind the book that I wrote. And most of the lectures that I give, to give examples, to cite illustrations, to explain what it meant to be a citizen, what it meant to be a citizen. Thank you.
Now, this was not meant to be a homily. This was meant to communicate a number of ideas that are open to discussion and to debate. We're going to take a 3-minute break, and I ask you to do two things. Number one, keep your questions for all of us. Don't come up and ask them privately. Murray will take a 3-minute rest, because that's all he needs. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to come back in 3 minutes, and please let everything come out. The toughest questions you have, the most agonizing concerns that you have, because behind what all that this book and these series of ideas present is a tremendous amount of documentation. Many, many historical examples, only a few of which were mentioned even in Murray's presentation. So there's a lot more that can be made and can be presented in order to demonstrate this thing. So we're going to have a 3-minute break. Now, during this 3-minute break, you can also take an opportunity to get Murray Bookchin to autograph one of his books for you.
No, that's the 5-minute break. The 2 minutes are...
This is a unique opportunity for you to get a book dedicated to yourself by an illustrious author. He's still alive. And he's still alive. Thank you. Okay? 3 minutes. All right, has everybody a seat that wants to sit? Okay, now, please step forward or come forward with all of your concerns, all of your questions. The tougher they are, the better.
He doesn't have to lose.
That's right. You know, if you feel that there were things that Murray said which were either unrealistic or difficult to grasp, just don't hold back from asking what you have on your in your heart and in your mind. Please.
I want to make just one observation, if I may, please. I have been speed running, so that I've almost been falling over my words. I welcome the opportunity now to have a more leisurely discussion, because I tried to cover far too much ground in only a span of 24 hours. 3 and 3 is 6, well, 24 hours. I tried to cover a book. In fact, I tried to cover several books, and I tried to add a great deal of material to what is either not in the book, or try to, at least very broadly, deal with questions that have worked out in considerable detail in the book. So I've been just speed rapping so quickly that my thinking ran ahead of my words, and my words sometimes ran ahead of each other. I hope you'll understand that I normally do not talk this way. I had to get it all in. Now that we got it all in, let's relax, and we've got a good hour and a half for you to get it all out.
Bob Mayo.
Yeah. I assume you weren't really being serious when you said that about the resistance to Mrs. Thatcher in England and the consciousness of some of the opponents there. But of the serious
What did I say, please?
Well, you suggested that they weren't really conscious of what they were doing in resisting her attempts to smite the municipalities.
Right, so that's a point that has to be corrected, because you, if you think they were conscious, should get a response from me. I found out that they were amazingly unconscious. They were a bunch of Trotskyites, for the most part, who were not interested at all in Confederation.
Well, I know for a fact that that's not true, but...
I was there when it was happening. It was good, and I spoke to the people who were involved in it. But let us go. I don't want to get into an argument.
Never mind. I have a question, though, about the practicality of following through on some of the ideas which you're talking about. Particularly the question of residence and work, and the degree of self-sufficiency of the units, whether you call them wards or whatever one chooses to call them, but parts of what are now larger cities, which would be presumably, to the maximum extent possible, autonomous. And I wonder if, architecturally, for example, the question whether you're familiar with the concept of co-housing, which has not yet, I think, been used specifically for the purposes which you are talking about, which might, however, be well incorporated into it.
Can I take your question one at a time, because there are three questions? I was in England at the point that the Greater Council was being dissolved by Thatcher, and at the time, was it Manchester or Birmingham? You tell me which. You probably know. When attempts were made to actually get loans from German bankers rather than borrow from British ones to sustain one of the big council groups that existed in one of the larger of the British cities. And I can tell you very frankly that they were grossly unconscious, except for a few theorists who wrote books on it. There were several books that came out on local socialism. And the reason why this is important is because this is a problem that you're going to encounter if you try to follow this, a policy, call it local socialism, call it anything you want, call it libertarian municipalism, confederal municipalism. They were grossly unconscious for the most part. The people who were mainly spearheading this fight was the militant group. And that militant group was the Trotskyites. And I was a Trotskyite for a long time, and I know what Trotskyites believe. In fact, I was a Trotskyist, and Trotsky was a liar. Not that he was a distant Gothic hero, you know, like Achilles was the Greeks of the 4th century. And consequently, I can tell you that they wanted a nation-state and were merely using local socialism as a means to take over the government, okay? And they would have wanted a dictatorship of the proletariat and heaven help us if the Socialist Workers' Party of Britain took over England. I'd sooner live under Thatcher. That's another question. Because I don't want their brand of Trotskyite Stalinism. That's another question. So I would like to correct you on that one point. The second point that you're raising is, and it's no small question, do I believe in how can we achieve self-sustaining cities? I've written a piece against the idea of self-sustaining cities. I believe one of the great myths of the ecology movement is that you can have a self-sustaining community, and more importantly, that if you even could, it would be desirable. I regard it as undesirable. Nothing will make for parochialism and ingrownness and isolation than the fact that you're self-sustaining. When you're self-sustaining, then you can keep out blacks, you can keep out people you don't like, you can keep out people with long noses, you can keep out people with dark hair, you can keep out people with tan skin, and blah, 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 and various epicanthic eyes, and so on and so on and so forth. That I don't want. Confederation is interdependence. Wait, I have to answer one question before I can even listen to yours. Confederation depends upon interdependence, not independence. There is nothing more regressive, in my view, than ecological notions that are widely prevalent, and people don't even know what they're saying when they say it, of a totally self-sustaining community. A self-sustaining community is not a desideratum. It is, in fact, a good source of parochialism, which could lead to narrow-mindedness and could actually lead to intercity wars and conflicts. It is interdependence with a relative degree of using resources, if I may use that word, as efficiently and effectively and locally as possible. That is desirable. That is okay. At that point, you're not creating great big gaping holes, such as exist in Minnesota ore mines that are irreparable. I mean, they're canyons already as a result of iron ore mining in the Mesabi Range. When they discovered the Mesabi Range, which was beautiful flat country, they found that it had the highest grade ore in North America, at least they thought they did. And what they did is build the equivalent of the Grand Canyon by scooping it out. And now they have a disastrous mess. That is industry organized on a nation-state basis. Don't use local ores, use the Mesabi Range. In the meantime, up along the Hudson River, there are all kinds of mines that are dead now, that really provided much of the cannon and metals for the American Union Army in the Civil War. And these are dead because they are not regarded as, quotes, profitable, quotes, for national purposes. It is the national division of labor where once Detroit made most of the cars, Pittsburgh made most of the steel, and California came out with most of the spiritual pollution, besides oranges and other such things. That division of labor, to multiply it over and over and over again, not to speak of cotton in the South, when it was then the primary crop, and tobacco, and so on and so forth. That and wheat, of course, great big wheat fields extending to the horizon. I emphasize that that is not what we want. We do not want a national division of labor, and we do not want an international division of labor. Let me stress that, because that is the excuse quite frequently for a minimal state. How are you going to coordinate the coffee from Brazil, you know what I mean, with well, what does America make? Movies from Hollywood. How are you going to coordinate it? That has provided the biggest excuse that Jim O'Connor, eco-Marxist, very well-intentioned, whom I personally respect, Andre Gortz, whom I don't respect so much, and I don't think is well-intentioned. I'm willing to give each person his or her due. Their notion of a minimal state. What we have to do is recognize that we get, in the most ecological way, those things we need from the areas in which we live. But very important is the fact that we must get things that we need from other communities, or else we will. And I don't think we really can attain this, but the goal of attaining this can produce a degree of parochialism that would make a community introverted, turned inward, and being self-sufficient can face the whole world with barbed wire. Now you want to go on with co-housing, please, because I'm not familiar with it.
Well,
you mean shared housing?
It started in Denmark, I believe, that it's really a system of housing where you have some communal parts communal building where, for example, you have everyone eating together, although it's not compulsory, but most people in the units of housing will eat there. There are certain other functions which and shared machinery, for example, dishwashers or washing machines and so on.
You mean what they're doing? They did in Berkeley in the 60s, right? That's what they did. I know. I traveled through about 70 communes in the 60s, and everywhere they were doing what you call co-housing. I would like to recommend something else, if I may. May I? The Greeks, if I may use the word generically, when I usually mean the Athenians, and to some extent the Spartans, had public eating places for the whole community. The Italians still do this to a limited degree on their Saints' Day in various Italian areas, particularly New York. Have any of you ever seen this? Have you ever attended an Italian Saints Festival? Did any of you see the opening of Godfather 2? Do you remember when the young De Niro wanders through and they're having the Saints holiday and everybody's pinning dollar bills onto the figure of the Virgin Mary? And you hear that noise and everybody's eating and gulping and eating pasta and eating sausages and just having a great time. And there were all kinds. That kind of public festival is a different thing. That kind of eating together, which the Spartans and the Athenians both practiced, the public meal in the orchestra of the Agora, that was worth it. And to this day, replicas of it exist in Italian cities, in fact, generally in Mediterranean cities, because it's much too cold north of the Rhine to start doing that. But there they did that on the Saints' Days, and turning it into civic holidays where there is consociation and people eat together in a community and share food and celebrate civic unity, which happened during the French Revolution, by the way. You know, the great festivals of the French Revolution. Those things, I would say, is something to be desired. As to co-housing, as you put it, or what we used to call communes in different parts of the country in the U.S. during the 60s, those things depend very much upon how people want to live. That is a purely creative thing, and people can innovate it or reject it and let them do as they want. I'm trying to be very brief in my response.
You had a question, but before you ask it, could we ask somebody to open up one of those windows or perhaps both, just to help the air circulate? That would be great, even for a short period. Please.
Yeah, well, you've pretty well answered my question. I agree with you that we cannot have totally independent communities.
Oh, no.
At least I fully agree. The only thing I think you've covered that was that there is this danger when we have this idea where we do get goods from other communities, where we have, like today, where the average vegetable in the state travels 1,200 miles to reach the table. This to me is ridiculous, and we should strive to what Keynes called it. You should never have free trade of ideas and etc. This is necessary, but free trade of goods, this should not be. Now, obviously, these are extreme things. I think we should aim to a certain form of independence where you are a certain degree of self-sufficiency, where we're not creating these, banana republics where they grow our coffee and are reduced to starvation because of their land is taken up. So I just wanted to stress that, but I think you covered that anyway.
Yes, I think we agree on that score. I just want to make one little point, if I may. The New York into which I was born in the 1920s, I was born at the very beginning of the 1920s.
21.
21. How close can you get to the beginning, short of getting into 1920? Then I have to do it in another era. In the New York into which I was born, most of our ducks came from Long Island, which is now within very easy commuting distance of the center of the city. Most of our eggs came both from Long Island and Vinland in New Jersey, which is also within very easy commuting distance. When I say easy commuting distance, I say between an hour and an hour and a half. Most of our apples came from the Adirondacks, you see, which was, well, give or take 60 miles away from New York. Pears. We got our oranges, to be sure, from Florida in those days. Our chickens came, and ducks came from both Long Island and from Vinland. And most of our garden vegetables came from what was then called on the license plate the Garden State, New Jersey, right across the Hudson River. And I used to see, within just a walking distance of where I lived, if I was willing to walk for 2 hours, I would see farmers with big straw hats and hand plows and horses growing vegetables for New York City. Now, I'm not going to deny that apricots And I'm not going to deny that out-of-season cabbages and lettuces and whatever you like came from the Imperial Valley and so on and so forth. But cheese and milk and everything like that, in great part, came from only within a 60-mile radius of the city of New York. Now, everything comes from California, Wisconsin, Kansas, and whatever you can think of. And virtually nothing is grown in these areas but a lot of bedroom suburbs. And that's what you have going on.
I had the extreme...
And by the way, the population of New York officially has not changed by even 150,000 since the time I was born there, 8 million, and it's still about 8 million now. But you have a lot of suburbs out there. And these people, many of them really belong out in the countryside, but they left villages and have deserted them. And as I pointed out, 1 out of every 3 counties in the United States is empty. And they want to turn it into a new prairie and let, what's his name again, Kevin Costner loose there, and play Dancing with Wolves and have bison and...
Linda Barton.
Can we truly have a new politics in the way that you defined it without a common ethic?
I'm sorry?
Without a common ethic. Can we have a
I think we have to develop an ethic, yes. I think it has to be an ethic that we have to develop. It's not one that I would want to serve down from Mount Sinai or something. It's not a commandment, but I think it has to be a rational ethic, and that ethic is one of complementarity. If you want that explained, I'd be glad to discuss it. Please. You want me to explain? No? Okay. By the way, it is not echo as, unfortunately, appears in the current issue of our generation. I know its editor is here and is my dearest of friends. But it's not what is called ecocentrism, which is, in my opinion, the craziest notion I ever heard of today. Complementarity is the idea, basically, that to make a whole, we are all part of that whole. And we bring to that whole what is unique in ourselves. And we complement each other. Nowadays, the ethic is basically either utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. Okay, that's one possible thing that can be. Or it can be a lofty ethic like do unto others as you would do unto yourself, which is really the Kantian imperative, do nothing, the categorical imperative. Do nothing that you cannot legislate into a law for everyone, okay? Or you can, but it's still the famous commandment, do unto others as you would do unto yourself. By the way, some people are so self-destructive that I don't recommend that. There is additionally a very instrumental ethic. What's good for you is good for you, what's good for me is good for me, and we can go to war over the issue very easily, I assure you. I won't go into